The Aegean Sea is calm tonight, but in 1997 it swallowed a story so disturbing that even divers decades later refused to speak of what they found. Imagine a ferry leaving port in northern Greece packed with families, students, and workers heading home. The sea was mild, the journey routine, until the ship was discovered adrift hours later, empty. No panic, no lifeboats launched. The cabins still held luggage, shoes lined neatly under bunks, meals half finished on tables. But the passengers? Every last one had vanished. Now pause and ask yourself, if this happened on the ferry you boarded, what would you believe? A freak accident no one witnessed? A coordinated disappearance at sea? Or something much older? Something tied to the waters of the Aegean itself? For years, authorities called it a tragedy. But when divers returned 2 decades later, what they uncovered inside the wreck changed everything. They found sealed cabins that hadn't been touched by water. They found objects that shouldn't have been there. And they found markings on the walls, names scratched into metal, names that matched passengers long missing. If you're drawn to mysteries that defy explanation, you're in the right place. Tell us where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe. Tonight we step aboard a ferry that set sail with hope and returned as a ghost. You picture it clearly. The port of Thessaloniki, October 1997, lanterns swaying in the salt wind, horns echoing across the Aegean like low thunder, families cluster on the pier, children clutching stuffed animals, young couples holding hands, fishermen watching idly as luggage is carried aboard the Erevos, a ferry whose name means darkness in Greek. You imagine yourself among them, standing with a paper ticket folded in your palm, wondering if you should be excited or uneasy. The night smells of diesel fuel and fried food from vendors along the dock. The sea looks calm, gentle swells glittering under moonlight as if inviting every passenger into its embrace. The Erevos was not new. Built in the 1970s, its once bright paint now peeled at the edges, lifeboats streaked with rust. But ferries like this were common, workhorses connecting islands and coastal towns. Passengers trusted it because everyone did. The ferry was a bridge across water, nothing more, nothing less. That evening, roughly 120 people boarded. Tourists, commuters, students heading back after visiting family, even a small group of soldiers returning quietly to base. Their voices filled the deck, laughter mingling with the cries of gulls overhead. At 9:45 p.m., the ship's horn blew, a long, mournful note. Ropes were cast, engines roared, and the Erevos slipped into the open sea. On the pier, loved ones waved until shadows swallowed the vessel. It should have been an ordinary night crossing. But by morning, the Erevos would drift silently, its decks deserted, its cabins frozen in time. You imagine the first hours on board, children chasing each other down narrow corridors, a young man leaning against the railing smoking, a priest murmuring prayers softly as beads clicked in his hand. The cafeteria clattered with trays, cups of thick Greek coffee, plates of spanakopita. A radio in the corner played a pop song that would be forgotten the moment the ferry disappeared. And then small details. Shoes placed neatly beside bunks, backpacks under seats, a stroller folded near the stairwell. All the tiny rituals of travel that remind you these were real people, not phantoms. They packed, they laughed, they lived. Every object was a bookmark of presence. But presence would soon become absence. The sea remained calm through the night. Logs later showed no storms, no rogue waves. Yet sometime after midnight, signals from the Erevos ceased. No distress calls, no SOS. By dawn, radar still placed the ferry on course, engines humming faintly. But when a Coast Guard patrol intercepted it, something was terribly wrong. The ship drifted without command. No crew on the bridge. No passengers on deck. Cabins unlocked, lights still glowing, food still warm. The entire vessel a floating ghost. Investigators boarded quickly. Their boots echoed in empty halls. They shouted, but their voices bounced back unanswered. Below-deck luggage sat stacked neatly in racks. In cabins, beds were turned down, blankets folded as though untouched. In the cafeteria, breakfast trays lined the counter, porridge half-spooned, bread broken mid-bite. It was as though time had paused mid-motion, erasing only the people. But wait, what about the lifeboats? They hung untouched, ropes still tied, rust unchanged. None were missing. No sign of panic, no rush to escape. It was impossible. 120 souls had simply walked off a ferry that never docked. You picture the investigators searching deeper, descending into the belly of the ship where machinery still throbbed. The engine room was manned by no one, gauges steady, diesel fumes heavy. A radio microphone dangled loosely as if dropped mid-sentence, but the logbooks were blank after 11:57 p.m. No one recorded a final word. The silence became heavier the longer they searched. It wasn't just absence. It was watchfulness, as though the ship itself waited. And then they found the first anomaly. In cabin 42, carved faintly into the wooden bunk frame, a name, Eleni. It matched a passenger listed on the manifest. But her bag sat neatly at her feet. Her jacket hung on the hook, her shoes lined beneath the bed. Only her body was missing. Elsewhere, more names appeared, scratched into walls, written in shaky pen on paper napkins. They seemed hurried, desperate, as though each passenger tried to leave proof they had been there. But the notes ended abruptly, incomplete sentences trailing off into nothing, and then, in the galley, an object out of place. A silver pocket watch stopped at exactly 12:17 a.m. Its chain twisted as though yanked sharply. No one claimed it. No records tied it to any passenger. Divers arrived within hours, circling the hull, searching for damage. None. The ship was intact. It had not sunk, not capsized, not burned. It was sound, which meant the vanishings had happened inside, behind locked doors, in silence. But the strangest discovery came later that week. When forensic teams dusted the captain's cabin, they found fingerprints layered thick across the desk, the wheel, the glass. But none matched the crew. None matched passengers. They belonged to people not listed on any manifest, as if others had been on board, unseen, unregistered. You imagine being the parent of one of those missing. Imagine standing on the dock as authorities tell you there are no bodies, no survivors, no answers. Only luggage, only shoes, only silence. Would you believe it was human hands? Or would you begin to wonder if the sea itself had taken them? The case was sealed quickly. Official reports cited unknown catastrophic event. Newspapers called it the Aegean ghost ship. Families received condolences, but no remains, no graves. For months, rumors swirled, smugglers, pirates, even human trafficking. But none explained the untouched lifeboats, the warm food, the carved names. And then years later, whispers resurfaced. Divers exploring the wreck claimed the sealed cabins weren't all sealed. Some still contained air pockets. Inside, they said, were objects that didn't belong. Notebooks written years after 1997, shoes too modern, and names carved that hadn't existed then. Names of people alive today. The ferry hadn't just swallowed its passengers. It had begun writing new ones, which leaves you staring at the dark water, imagining a ship adrift with no crew, no sound, only echoes waiting in its halls. You imagine stepping aboard, hearing footsteps that aren't yours, voices too faint to follow, and you wonder, with dread rising in your chest, if the Erevos could still be drifting somewhere out there. What would you do if its horn sounded tonight, closer than you expected? You step deeper into the deserted ferry, the steel corridors echoing under your footsteps, the air thick with salt and silence. The Erevos feels alive in its stillness, as if every door conceals eyes pressed against the other side, waiting for you to turn the handle. You imagine yourself as one of the investigators that first morning, flashlight in hand, knowing that somewhere between Thessaloniki and its destination, 120 people simply ceased to exist. No screams recorded, no alarms triggered. Just absence. The cabins were the first place they searched. Rows of doors opened into small rooms lined with bunk beds, narrow windows, tiny closets. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Blankets folded neatly, luggage arranged, shoes placed in pairs, as though their owners had simply stepped out for a moment. But it was the little things that made investigators pause. A half-played card game on one table, coins scattered between the cards, a child's sketch of a ferry drawn in crayon taped to the wall, a deck of photographs spread across another bunk, faces smiling at a camera that no longer existed. None of it felt abandoned. It felt interrupted. One cabin held a wedding dress still draped in plastic, the veil spilling across a suitcase. The bride's passport lay open beside it, her photo frozen in youthful confidence. But her name, Maria Caras, was also carved faintly into the wood of the bunk, her hand forced into desperation before she disappeared. Investigators recorded it all, but what explanation could they give her family? That she had stopped mid-journey to carve her own name into the ship? Another cabin contained journals, pages filled with neat handwriting that stopped abruptly mid-sentence. We heard it again outside the door. The line trailed off into nothing. the pen still pressed against paper hard enough to tear through. Whatever was heard, no one ever described. And then came the children's quarters. School trip groups often took ferries, and that night was no different. Toys lay scattered across the floor. A plastic car, a stuffed bear with a missing ear, puzzle pieces half assembled. But the beds were cold, the sheets flat. Some investigators swore they heard faint laughter echoing through the corridor, though no recording devices captured it. One even claimed he felt a small hand brush against his coat when no one stood behind him. By the time he turned, the corridor was empty. But wait, down below in the cargo deck, things grew stranger. Among parked cars and crates, one van stood with its back doors ajar. Inside were children's backpacks piled neatly, their zippers open, notebooks stacked. None of the manifests listed the van. No owner came forward. And inside the notebooks, sketches appeared. Drawings of waves, tunnels, and faces without eyes. Some dated to 1997. Others bore dates far later. Impossible dates, as though the ferry continued to collect stories after it was abandoned. The divers confirmed the van hadn't been submerged. Its paint still glossy, its tires full. Forensic tests suggested it had been placed there years after the ferry vanished. But how? No ships had docked. No cranes had lowered it, unless something else brought it aboard. You imagine standing there, staring into that van, the hairs rising on your arms as you realize the ferry wasn't just abandoned. It had been used. Up on deck, investigators reviewed the logbooks again. The captain's notes ended cleanly at 11:57 p.m. But tucked behind the log was a torn page with only 2 words, "Not alone." Whispers spread through the team. Some believed stowaways had boarded. Others insisted something older, something tied to the Aegean itself, had come for them. Legends told of spirits that claimed travelers, dragging them into the sea. Fishermen spoke of voices carried on the wind, luring people overboard. But if passengers had jumped, why were there no splashes, no missing lifeboats, no alarms? And then came the most chilling find. In cabin 17, investigators discovered a camera. Its film was half spooled, as though the photographer had been interrupted. When developed, the pictures showed ordinary snapshots. Children smiling, families at dinner, a man playing guitar on deck. But the final frame was different. It showed the ferry corridor at night, dimly lit. At the far end, a figure stood. Tall, thin, face blurred into shadow. No one recognized him. He was not on the manifest. The camera had captured what the eye could not. The photograph leaked years later, spreading online, debated endlessly. Some called it a trick of light. Others saw proof of something unnatural. But those who studied it closely noticed one more detail. The shadow figure wasn't facing the camera. He was facing a cabin door, and carved faintly into that same door was a single word: open. Theories multiplied. Had someone lured passengers one by one into locked rooms? Had they been herded below deck? Or had something else opened doors they should never have touched? Authorities eventually sealed the report, calling the case unsolvable. Families were told only that their loved ones were presumed lost at sea. But in Thessaloniki, whispers still grew. Some claimed to see the ferry itself returning on foggy nights, its decks lit, silhouettes moving behind windows. Fishermen swore radios picked up faint voices calling names that matched the manifest. And once in 2005, a Coast Guard vessel claimed to see the Erevos adrift again. But when they approached, the ship vanished into mist. You picture yourself on that Coast Guard boat, watching lights shimmer, hearing voices rise, then realizing the sea itself had erased what you saw, and the question presses harder. If the passengers are gone, why do they keep leaving signs behind? The ferry's silence is not empty. It is deliberate, and in the last cabin investigators searched under a mattress. They found one final message scrawled in childish handwriting: "We're still here." The paper was dated 2002, which leaves you with only one thought, echoing louder than the sea itself. If the passengers never left, then where are they now? You imagine the sea swallowing light. The deeper you go, the dimmer the world becomes until your flashlight beam is a narrow blade cutting through endless dark. That's where the divers entered in 2018, decades after the Erevos first drifted empty. Their mission was simple on paper: survey the wreck, record its condition, and confirm there were no survivors or remains. But you know from the start that nothing about this ferry is simple. The hull leaned slightly on its side, rust bleeding from rivets like old wounds. Fish darted in and out of broken windows, barnacles clung to steel. But the ship wasn't a graveyard. It was intact, too intact as though waiting. Divers expected collapse, debris scattered. But the Erevos looked preserved, frozen mid-journey. One diver swore the anchor chain still trembled, as if the ship had only just been set adrift. Inside, cabins lay untouched. Suitcases rested against bunks, pillows sagged with mold. And yet, some things were wrong. A watch still ticked faintly on a nightstand. Though salt water should have killed it, a photograph pinned to a wall hadn't faded. Its ink as sharp as if printed yesterday. Even stranger, in the cafeteria, trays of food had molded differently. Some meals looked decades old, shriveled and black. Others seemed fresh, bread soft, fruit unspoiled. But wait. Deeper below deck, in sealed compartments, the divers found something chilling. Doors that should have been locked tight had been forced open from inside. Their edges bent outward, paint scraped by fingernails. Behind one, a corridor stretched farther than the ship's schematics allowed. According to blueprints, the ferry ended with steel bulkheads, but the divers swam through 20 more meters of corridor, lined with cabin doors that had no numbers. They opened one. Inside floated a child's shoe, red canvas, laces trailing. Forensic tests later confirmed it matched Maya Constantinou, a 12-year-old listed among the missing. But the shoe's material had not degraded. It was preserved as if time touched nothing in that hidden corridor. Another diver found writing etched into the wall. Letters scratched with something sharp, shaky, overlapping. Don't follow. The warning looked recent, grains of rust still fresh around the grooves. But how could it have been carved when the ship had been sealed for 21 years? The divers argued over what to do. Protocol demanded retreat, documentation, safe exit. But one team member insisted on pressing farther, recording every meter of this impossible passage. His camera streamed back to the surface crew. For minutes, the footage showed endless doors, each one closed. And then one opened by itself, the frame shook. The diver's breathing quickened, bubbles rising violently. He whispered through comms that he saw figures, people, standing inside the cabin, their faces pale, their eyes black voids. The feed cut instantly. On the surface, the crew watched static fill the screen. The diver never resurfaced. His body was never recovered. Authorities labeled it equipment failure, blaming panic and oxygen deprivation. But the rest of the team knew better. They had seen the door open. They had heard his voice. And some swore the static wasn't just noise. If you slowed the tape, you could hear faint voices whispering names. Names that hadn't yet appeared on any missing persons list. You imagine yourself watching that footage, your stomach twisting as the voices grow clearer, one of them calling a name you recognize, your own. The divers who survived swore never to return. They left behind footage, artifacts, fragments of the truth. But one object stood out most. Pulled from that impossible corridor, sealed in a waterproof bag, was a notebook. Its cover warped, its pages brittle, but inside were entries dated years after 1997. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. It described days, meals, dreams, and one line repeated across pages. The sea won't let us go. Handwriting experts matched the script to Eleni, the young woman whose name had been carved into the bunk years earlier. But Eleni had vanished in 1997. How could she have written entries in 2003, 2007, even 2010? Unless the ferry didn't just trap bodies, it trapped time. You picture holding that notebook, feeling the salt-stiffened pages tremble, reading words that shouldn't exist. You wonder if the passengers lived on in some other dimension, writing desperately, begging someone to find them. Or worse, if someone else wrote it pretending to be them, to keep the story alive as bait. On shore, when the evidence reached families, grief turned to horror. For some, the notebook was proof their children and spouses had survived. For others, it was a cruel trick, a forgery planted to reopen wounds. But the details were too precise. One entry described a birthday cake with blue candles, exactly as a mother remembered baking the night before her daughter boarded the ferry. How could anyone else have known? Authorities silenced the divers quickly, confiscated the footage, sealed the artifacts. Official statements declared nothing unusual had been found. But word leaked anyway, and whispers grew louder. The Erevos wasn't a ghost. It was a prison. And then 1 year later, a fisherman pulled something from his nets. A photograph. Water-stained, edges torn, but the image clear. The deck of the Erevos. Passengers lined the railing, smiling. But in the back row, behind them, stood the same shadow figure from the last frame of the 1997 camera. Still blurred, still faceless. Still watching, the fisherman delivered it to police. Hours later, he vanished on the same stretch of sea. His boat drifted empty, nets tangled, coffee still warm in his cup, which leaves you with the same suffocating dread that haunted investigators for decades. If the ferry continues to give back pieces of its story, then someone or something still sails within it. And the next time it drifts to the surface, the question won't be what happened in 1997. It will be whether the Erevos is looking for new passengers. You imagine waiting on the dock that night in Thessaloniki, watching the Erevos pull away into darkness, never knowing it would return without the people you loved. For the families, the nightmare didn't begin with a mystery at sea. It began with silence. No frantic phone calls, no radio warnings, no last goodbyes. Just silence that stretched into dawn, then into weeks, then into years. At first, there was hope. Officials told parents and spouses that survivors might be found clinging to lifeboats, that passengers could have drifted to nearby islands. Coast Guard vessels scoured the Aegean, helicopters hovered low over the waves, fishermen searched coves. But nothing surfaced. Not a single body, not a single raft. Only the ferry itself, adrift and hollow. For the families, that absence was unbearable. You picture a mother standing in her kitchen, her child's shoes still by the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps that would never come. A husband staring at an untouched wedding dress, the veil still smelling faintly of salt air. A father who drove every week to the port, scanning arrivals, convinced he'd see his son step off another ship by mistake. And then came the belongings. Authorities cataloged luggage retrieved from the Erevos and returned it piece by piece. Suitcases arrived neatly sealed, clothes folded, photographs tucked in pockets. For many, it was worse than no return at all. A mother opened her daughter's bag and found a journal with the final line, "We'll be back before the sea takes us." A father unzipped a backpack and found notebooks filled with names written over and over. His son's name. His daughter's, then names he didn't recognize. Names of people who had never been on the manifest. The government's response was swift but cold. Compensation was offered, files were sealed, questions dismissed. Officials used phrases like maritime anomaly and structural failure, though the ship showed no signs of either. Families demanded open hearings. They begged for divers to keep searching. But budgets dried up and the case was declared closed. Still, the families did not stop. They formed a group, calling themselves the Voices of Erevos. They met in church basements, libraries, even on the docks where the ferry had last departed. They shared dreams, nightmares, and fragments of evidence that authorities had ignored. One woman swore she received a phone call 3 months after the disappearance. The line crackled, a man's voice whispered her name, and then static swallowed the rest. The call traced back to nowhere. Another parent claimed letters arrived at her home, postmarked years later with her son's handwriting. The words were jumbled, sentences broken. Cabins closed, don't open doors, don't let him in. Experts dismissed them as hoaxes, but the handwriting was real. And then there was the priest. Father Nikolaos, who had been scheduled to board the Erevos but missed it by chance, claimed he saw the ship again in 2001. Sailing under moonlight, its decks lit, passengers visible through windows. He swore they waved at him. When authorities pressed him, he refused to recant. He died 2 years later, but in his final sermon he left one cryptic line. "The sea does not take, it keeps. But wait." The families kept uncovering more. In 2005, a fisherman in Crete found a trunk washed ashore. Inside were clothes labeled with the ferry's passengers. But mixed among them were clothes that didn't match anyone. A child's sundress, a man's work uniform, garments decades older than 1997. Items from vanishings no one had connected until then. The families presented it all at a press conference. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled. But the next morning, headlines barely mentioned it. Instead, whispers spread that officials wanted the story buried. That they feared something older than politics, something rooted in the Aegean's history. You imagine being one of those parents, clutching a suitcase as though it still carried the warmth of your child's hands, staring at officials who refused to answer the only question that mattered. Where did they go? By the late 2000s, grief hardened into obsession. Families marked anniversaries not with candles but with protests. They left shoes on the steps of government buildings, a line of absence too loud to ignore. They mailed letters every year demanding answers. Most returned unopened, and some traveled to the coast themselves, boarding small boats, sailing into the night hoping to glimpse the Erevos reappear. A few never came back. Their vessels drifted empty, nets tangled, coffee still warm in their cups, the same way the ferry had been found. In 2012, a journalist uncovered sealed documents linking the Erevos to earlier disappearances. Ferry logs from 1983 and 1989 listed missing passengers who had vanished in similar ways. Their names quietly struck from records. None of those stories had reached the press. The pattern was clear. The Erevos was not the first ship to return without its people. It was simply the one that could no longer be hidden. For the families, this revelation was salt in the wound. Their grief was no longer just personal. It was part of something larger, a silence enforced for decades. And when they confronted officials again, they were told to stop. Some received anonymous notes slipped under their doors. Let them rest. Others reported seeing figures watching their houses at night, strangers in long coats standing too still in the shadows. You picture the fear of knowing not only had your child vanished, but someone wanted to erase even the question of how. And then came the most chilling encounter of all. In 2015, a father named Andreas received a call in the middle of the night. The voice on the line was thin, cracked with static, but unmistakably his daughter's. She had been 12 when she boarded the Erevos. Now she whispered, "We're still here, but not where you think." Before he could respond, the line cut. Tracing the call led nowhere, except to a payphone decommissioned 20 years earlier. Andreas told no one for weeks, convinced grief had broken him. But when other families confessed they too had heard voices, the pattern became undeniable. The sea was not silent. It was speaking, which leaves you standing in the shoes of those families, wondering if your loved one's story ended in 1997, or if it still unfolds somewhere beneath the waves, trapped in a ferry that refuses to release them. The fear is no longer only about the vanished. It is about the living, because every time the Erevos resurfaces in rumor or sighting, more people seem to disappear. And when families gathered for the 20th anniversary memorial in 2017, holding candles on the pier, the wind carried a sound across the water, a horn, long and mournful, echoing exactly like the one that blew the night their children sailed away. But no ship appeared. Only fog, which leaves you trembling with the same impossible thought that haunted those families. If the Erevos still sails, then whose names will it call next? You picture a dim government office in Athens, the air stale with cigarette smoke, stacks of files spilling across metal desks. That's where the investigators of the Erevos disappearance gathered in the winter of 1997. Outside, protests swelled. Families begged for answers. Inside, officials whispered about how quickly this needed to be closed. But there were those who refused to let silence win. Detective Stavros Dimitriou was one of them. He had served 20 years on the force, chasing smugglers and traffickers across the islands. He thought he had seen everything until he stepped aboard the drifting ferry. He remembered the way his flashlight beam fell across untouched breakfast trays, the smell of coffee still warm, though no one had been there to drink it. For weeks after, he couldn't shake the sense that the ship itself had eyes. You imagine him hunched over photographs of the cabins, circling anomalies with a trembling pen, names carved into wood, a watch frozen at 12:17, a corridor that shouldn't exist. He filed reports that stacked higher than his head. But every time he submitted them, his superiors sent them back, redacted, pages missing. Someone above him wanted the Erevos to vanish from memory as completely as its passengers. Still, Stavros dug deeper. He traced shipping records, maintenance contracts, old logs. What he found unsettled even him. The ferry had changed ownership 6 times in the decade before it disappeared. Each transfer was cash only, each registered to shell companies with no real address. When he pushed further, he found a name scribbled in margins: Aegean Holdings. No official record existed, no tax filings, just whispers in port ledgers. But wait. One dockworker remembered seeing men board the Erevos weeks before its final voyage. Not passengers, not crew. Strangers carrying crates marked with no origin, their faces hidden beneath caps. They loaded the boxes into the hold, then vanished. None of the manifests listed them. And when Stavros checked shipping containers after the ferry's recovery, every crate was gone. Where did they go? Theories multiplied. Some investigators believed smugglers staged the vanishings. Others suspected the ferry was part of a larger operation, a floating front for something darker. But how did that explain the untouched lifeboats, the carved names, the photographs that should not have existed? Then came the testimonies. A Coast Guard officer admitted under oath that radar logs from that night had been altered. The ferry appeared in two places at once. One signal near Thessaloniki, another far south near Skiathos. When pressed, his superiors silenced him. He resigned weeks later, vanishing from public view. Another witness, a diver, swore the sealed corridor wasn't man-made. The angles were wrong, the steel seamless as if grown rather than welded. He described it as a tunnel that bent light, making his reflection vanish in his own mask. Officials dismissed him as delusional. Weeks later, he was found drowned in shallow water, his lungs full of salt, though no water surrounded him. And yet Stavros persisted. He compiled evidence linking the Erevos to earlier disappearances. A freighter in 1983 that returned empty. A pleasure yacht in 1989 found adrift with meals still on the table. Even fishing vessels whose crews were never recovered. The pattern was undeniable. Ships weren't just sinking, they were being erased. You imagine Stavros standing before a board of stone-faced officials, his hands shaking as he laid out photographs, receipts, witness statements. He begged them to reopen the case, but they told him to burn the files. For national stability, they said, but the truth refused to stay buried. In 2001, Stavros received a package with no return address. Inside was a reel of film. When developed, it showed grainy footage from inside the Erevos. Passengers walking corridors, smiling, unaware of their fate. But in the final seconds, the frame tilted violently. A man in a cap entered the shot, tall, thin, face blurred into shadow. He wasn't listed on any manifest. The same figure appeared in earlier disappearances, whispered in fishermen's tales, drawn in journals. A presence that moved from ship to ship, never aging, always watching. Who was he? Stavros spent years chasing the answer, until his obsession consumed him. Colleagues said he muttered about the author of the sea, a phrase that made no sense to anyone else. Then in 2005 he vanished. His apartment was left intact. Files stacked neatly on the table, coffee cup still warm. Only one note remained scrawled across his wall. "He's writing me next." The files were confiscated, sealed in archives. But a junior investigator kept copies. She described them years later. Names of passengers scribbled in margins, dates circled that stretched back a century, and sketches of a ship that looked eerily like the Erevos, except drawn decades before it was built. You wonder what kind of investigation uncovers evidence of a ship before its time. You wonder if the ferry wasn't built, but summoned. And the question presses harder. What if the Erevos wasn't an accident of the sea, but a ritual? A stage that needed an audience of passengers to play its part? By the late 2000s, whispers among investigators grew darker. Some claimed colleagues received threats. Others swore they saw the ferry docked in ports where it shouldn't have been, its decks glowing faintly under moonlight. One officer even admitted he boarded it by mistake in 2010, thinking it was another ferry. He said the cabins were full of people alive, but when he blinked, they were gone. He died 2 weeks later. The files are still there, hidden in archives no one dares open. But families whisper that inside lies proof the Erevos was never a ferry at all. It was a vessel built for disappearance. And you imagine one investigator, alone at night, flipping through photographs of smiling passengers, knowing each face would vanish, and whispering to himself the question no one wanted answered. If the ferry chose them, then who will it choose next? You picture it. A crowded press room in Athens, microphones buzzing, reporters leaning forward. It's the summer of 2008, more than a decade after the Erevos drifted ashore empty, and suddenly there is a claim. Someone survived. A man steps to the podium, shoulders trembling, his hair gray though he is only in his 40s. He gives his name, Nikos Anagnostou. He says he was on the ferry that night in 1997, and he says he remembers. At first, no one believes him. His name was not on the manifest. No family came forward to claim him, but when he described the ferry's cafeteria in vivid detail, down to the pattern of the floor tiles and the radio song playing that night, journalists gasped. He spoke of cabins with half-finished card games, of a woman folding linens as though time had frozen. These were details never released to the public. You imagine sitting there, heart pounding, as he leaned into the microphone and whispered, "They didn't vanish. They were taken." Reporters pressed him. Taken by whom? By what? Nikos said only this. that at 12:17 a.m., the ship went silent. Lights flickered, the sea outside went still, and doors began to open by themselves. Passengers whispered of voices calling their names, one by one. Children clung to their parents. Crew shouted orders no one obeyed. And then he saw them, figures moving down the corridor. Tall, thin, wearing caps pulled low. Their faces never visible, but their hands pale, too pale. They touched the passengers, and those they touched disappeared. Not screamed, not struggled, just gone. When asked how he survived, Nikos shook his head. I didn't. Not really. But wait. His story cracked under scrutiny. He couldn't provide proof of his ticket, nor explain where he had been for 11 years. Some investigators swore he was a fraud, a man who memorized leaked files. Others feared the truth was worse, that he was exactly who he said he was, and that his survival was a mistake the Erevos wanted corrected. Days later, Nikos was found dead in his apartment. Heart failure, the papers claimed. But witnesses whispered of something stranger. His walls were covered in words scrawled over and over. Not me, not yet, not me. You imagine standing in that apartment, breathing the stale air, tracing the desperate writing. If he wasn't lying, then his death was no accident. And maybe the ferry had reached out from the sea to finish what it started. But Nikos wasn't the only one. Over the years, scattered claims surfaced. A woman in Thessaloniki said she recognized a passenger from the ferry walking past her bakery in 2003. He looked the same, not aged a day, his clothes still damp with sea spray. She called his name. He turned. And in that instant, his face blurred like fog. Then he vanished into the crowd. A fisherman in Lesbos swore he pulled a child onto his boat in 2010, clutching a soaked teddy bear. When the fisherman looked away for a moment, the boy was gone, leaving only the toy. Tests later confirmed the bear matched one listed among belongings from the Erevos, and in 2014, a tourist snapped a photograph of the harbor at Skiathos. In the background, nearly hidden, was a ship. Its decks lit, its windows crowded with faces. When experts enhanced the image, some of the faces matched the passenger manifest from 1997. Others did not, people alive and well, who swore they had never boarded the ferry. What does it mean when survivors surface who shouldn't? What does it mean when the dead walk the streets without aging, without records, without explanation? The families saw it as proof that their loved ones weren't lost but trapped, proof that the ferry was a prison, its passengers released only as shadows. Officials, however, dismissed it all. They called it hysteria, tricks of grief, digital manipulation. But you can't ignore the pattern. Each sighting, each so-called survivor, was followed by silence. Witnesses who spoke too loudly found themselves discredited, ruined, or vanished themselves. And every trail circled back to the same place, the sea around Thessaloniki, where the Erevos first slipped into darkness. One investigator, a woman named Eleni Kostas, became obsessed. She tracked sightings, cross-referenced photographs, and traveled to every dock where whispers placed the ferry. In 2016, she claimed she found something extraordinary. A child's diary. Its pages warped with salt, its entries dated 2015. But the handwriting matched that of a boy who had boarded the Erevos in 1997. The entries described days aboard the ship, meals, games, endless corridors. The last line read, "He's writing new names now." Eleni went public. She said the ferry wasn't finished, that it was still taking passengers, that the vanishings weren't over. 2 weeks later, she disappeared. Her car was found abandoned on a coastal road. In the glove compartment, investigators discovered a ferry ticket dated 1997. Her name was on it, but she hadn't been on the manifest. Not until then. You picture yourself in her place, realizing that someone, or something, had rewritten the past to claim you. That survival wasn't freedom, but delay. That anyone who looked too closely at the Erevos risked being written into its story. And as you think of that, another truth chills you deeper. Survivors aren't proof of life. They're proof the ferry can choose who stays, who leaves, who is remembered, and who is erased. Which leaves you staring at the sea, heart racing with one unbearable question. If the ferry can write new names into its manifest, what's to stop it from writing yours? You picture it. Midnight in 2019, a Greek Coast Guard vessel cutting across the dark Aegean. The sea is calm, moonlight rippling faintly when a voice crackles over the radio. A merchant ship has spotted lights, strange, steady lights where no vessel should be. Coordinates are given, engines roar, and then on the horizon it appears, the Erevos. 2 decades after it was found adrift and stripped bare, there it is again, its decks glowing faintly as though welcoming passengers aboard. Crew rush to the railing, binoculars pressed tight, eyes wide. They see windows lit, curtains shifting, and behind the glass, faces. Dozens of them, pale still, gazing out across the water. You imagine standing on that deck, pulse hammering as the ferry's horn bellows long and low, the same mournful note that families swore they heard at the 20th anniversary vigil. The sound vibrates through the hull of your ship, through your bones, until you feel it in your teeth. Something inside you whispers to turn back, but you can't. The Erevos is right there, impossibly real. When the Coast Guard hails the ferry, no reply comes. They circle closer, searchlights cutting across its hull. That's when they see it, the name. Painted fresh, black against rust, letters sharp as if no time had passed. Erevos. Yet divers swore the lettering had corroded away years earlier. The ship is new and old all at once, like time itself has bent to keep it alive. But wait. The closer they get, the stranger it becomes. Radar shows nothing. To instruments, the Erevos doesn't exist. Only the human eye sees it. Cameras glitch, recording only static. The ferry is present and absent, seen and unseen. A ghost made flesh. Braver crew lower a dinghy and row toward it. Their searchlights sweep across the deck, catching glimpses. A child's shoe resting against the rail. A woman's veil fluttering in wind that doesn't blow. An abandoned suitcase with stickers from the 1990s, still crisp and colorful. And then a figure. Tall, thin, cap pulled low, standing by the entrance to the main cabin. He raises his head. Though his face is shadowed, every man in that dinghy swears he was looking straight at them. Fear cracks. They retreat, but not before one of them swears he heard voices carried across the water. Not screams. Not cries. Just calm, unbroken whispers repeating one phrase. Come aboard. News of the sighting leaks within days. Families demand answers. Officials scramble to contain the story, blaming optical illusions, fatigue, tricks of light. But the Coast Guard men know what they saw, and one confesses privately it was them. The passengers. They never left. You picture yourself on that patrol, torn between terror and temptation, because deep down a thought claws at you. If the Erevos has returned, maybe the lost can be found. Maybe families can be reunited. Maybe answers lie waiting on those haunted decks. But hope is dangerous. 2 months later, a tourist ferry near Skiathos reports a collision. The captain swears another ship appeared out of nowhere, forcing him to veer sharply. Passengers scream, the vessel lurches, but when they look, there's nothing. Only open water. Yet some swear they saw a massive ferry slip past in the fog, silent as the grave. More sightings follow. Fishermen claim their radios pick up chatter in languages decades out of date. Divers report hearing knocking from beneath their boats, rhythmic, insistent, like fists pounding steel. And in one chilling case, a yacht anchored overnight returned to port with no crew aboard. Only a single ticket from the Erevos pinned to the wheel. It becomes undeniable. The ferry is back. Not wrecked, not forgotten, active, and with its return, disappearances begin again. Small at first, fishermen, tourists, lone sailors, then more. Each time, belongings resurface days later, tucked into strange places. A purse found on a beach hundreds of miles away. A child's toy discovered inside a cave no one had entered for years. Always objects. Never people. Authorities clamp down. They ban night travel across certain waters. They censor reports. But whispers can't be silenced. Families say the Erevos isn't just haunting the sea. It's hunting. One Coast Guard officer finally speaks. He says he boarded the ferry in 2019 alone, while his team circled outside. He claims he walked its corridors, saw its cabins, heard voices calling his name. When he returned to his boat, hours had passed, though his watch showed only minutes. He begged his superiors to believe him. Weeks later he was gone, his boat found adrift, his gear still on board. You imagine walking those corridors yourself? Feeling the weight of unseen eyes, wondering if the ship is alive, if it chooses who can leave and who must stay. The question grows unbearable. What if the Erevos has never left at all? What if it sails always, slipping in and out of sight, taking who it needs, returning only when it chooses? And in 2020, proof emerges. Divers exploring near Skyethos record footage of a massive shadow gliding beneath them. At first, they think it's a whale. Then lights flicker across its hull. The outline is unmistakable, a ferry. The video leaks online, viewed millions of times before it is removed. Authorities dismiss it as doctored. But those who saw it swear the name Erevos glowed faintly in the deep, which leaves you with one final, suffocating thought as you stare into the black waters of the Aegean. If the ferry has returned, then it isn't just the past haunting the sea, it's the present. And maybe the next time a ship disappears, it won't be written off as coincidence. It will be called what it is. The Erevos choosing again. You picture it. The year is 2022, 25 years after the Erevos first returned without its people. The world has changed, but the sea has not. Fishermen still whisper of strange lights. Coast Guard officers still avoid certain waters after dark. And families still stand on docks with photographs in their hands, waiting for loved ones who never stepped off the ferry. By now, you know the pattern. The ship reappears when no one expects it. Sometimes in fog, sometimes beneath the surface, gliding like a shadow. And every time it leaves behind something, an object, a photograph, a receipt that shouldn't exist. Proof not of life, but of presence. Proof that the passengers remain. Proof that the sea keeps what it takes. Investigators still search, though quietly now. They slip into archives at night, pulling sealed files, scanning forgotten reels. In one basement in Athens, an intern discovers something extraordinary. A manifest from 1923. Not a ferry, but a passenger liner. Its name, Erevos. Its story identical. A ship that left port, that returned without its people. The name was recycled, the vessel rebuilt, but the pattern never changed. Ships aren't designed to vanish. They're designed to sail, and yet this one has done both again and again across a century. You imagine flipping through those pages, your fingers trembling as you see names, dates, handwriting. You realize the Erevos isn't one ship. It's many. A cycle, a ritual, an author rewriting the same story across generations. And then there are the recordings. In 2021, divers released audio they swore came from inside the wreck. Low static at first, then whispers. The same phrase repeated in Greek, in English, in languages no one recognized. Come aboard. When slowed, some claimed you could hear names spoken. Not just names of the vanished. New names. Names of those who listened. But wait, there's something darker. Families of the lost begin to vanish too. Not aboard ships, not at sea, but from their own homes. Doors left unlocked. Meals unfinished. Chairs still pulled from tables. Investigators find objects where they shouldn't be. A child's toy tucked beneath a bed. A ferry ticket pinned to a window. The story is spreading as though the ferry is no longer bound to the sea. By the time journalists chase the story again, officials refuse to comment. They say the files are closed, that the Erevos was scrapped, dismantled, forgotten. But you know that's a lie. Because sightings keep coming. Because families keep grieving. Because the silence is louder than truth. And here's the part that haunts you most. People still board ferries every day. Tourists, commuters, families with children. They buy tickets, carry luggage, laugh on decks, and none of them know whether their ship is just another ferry, or whether beneath the paint and steel it's the Erevos waiting to write a new manifest. You can almost feel it, can't you? The quiet hum of engines beneath your feet, the salty wind on your face, the faint sound of a horn that lingers just too long. You wonder if your name is being whispered somewhere below deck. If a notebook already carries your handwriting, written years from now, begging someone to find you, and the silence presses harder, because you realize the truth no one dares speak aloud. The Erevos never ended. It is still sailing. So I'll leave you with this question. If the ferry reappeared tonight, if you saw its lights glowing across the water, would you dare to step aboard? Or would you turn away knowing some doors should never be opened? Some stories were never meant to stay buried. Don't let them vanish. Keep them alive with us.